All right, we'll give it one more minute and see if anybody else comes, and then we'll start. All right. Tonight is part 19 of our series on the 8th chapter of Bava Kam. And we are tonight on pages 89b and 90a. And we are finally going to finish our discussion of usufruct property and property that is partly owned by somebody who is the official owner and partly owned by somebody who has the right to use it. And this packet is a little bit shorter than usual because then it gets to the next Mishnah, which is extremely long, and there wasn't a sensible way to start something new without stopping in the middle of it right away. So whatever, but at least we're getting to the end of the topic tonight. Okay. So we had seen last time a Braita in which the case was that we had a wife who had brought into the marriage a slave as nichsei malug, as usufruct property, and so she owns the slave, but the person who has a right to demand services of the slave is her husband. And the Braita, we had two Braitot about the same case. One Braita said that one Braita said that if she knocks out a tooth or an eye on this slave, he goes free, but if her husband injures the slave does not go free. That seemed to indicate that the slave belonged to her and didn't belong to her husband. The other Braita said actually that it doesn't matter. Neither of them can set the slave free by injuring the slave. And we had suggested that maybe this was indicating a dispute about the question of whether the decree of Usha that we were talking about actually exists. Right? Just to remind you, the decree of Usha in question is the decree that if a woman sells nichsei malug during the course of her marriage and then she dies still married to the husband can claw back the assets from the buyer. And so the Gemara last week had then said, well, no, it must be that one of these Braitot, the Braita that says that she is still the owner of the slave, that Braita was written before the decree at Usha was made, and the other Braita, the one that says that neither of them really owns the slave, that was made after the decree of Usha, and that in fact it was this decree that she can't really sell her property that made her no longer the owner, such that if she damaged the slave, he doesn't automatically get emancipated. Okay, so now we are going to offer an alternative explanation for that situation. So here we are. So alternatively, maybe both Braitot come from after the decree. And they both believe that the decree of Usha exists. But according to the Braita that says that the woman can emancipate the slave and the man cannot, my Tama, what's the reason for that ruling? Kidder Rava. It's like what Rava said. So let's see what Rava said. De Amar Rava, Hekdesh Chametz v'Shichrur Mafki'in Midei Shibu. So Rava has this general principle, not just here, but in general, that there are three things that you can do to your property that somebody else has a lien on. Somebody else has a right to take the property away from you. But there are three things you can do to your property before they take it away that will make it impossible for them to take it. Of course, they also make it impossible for you to have it, but you weren't going to get to keep it anyway. And those three things are hekdesh. You can dedicate an animal as a sacrifice, right? This is, at least according to the sources I looked up, this is only talking about the kind of hekdesh in which you dedicate a sacrificial animal to be sacrificed on the altar. This is not talking about the kind of hekdesh where you just donate money or other assets to the building fund of the Beit HaMikdash. So this is what we call hekdesh haguf, now we call hekdesh damim. Or you can, and that only, of course, would work on an animal that's qualified as a sacrifice. Or if the liened property is a slave, you can emancipate them, right? Now they're no longer property. Not only do they not belong to you, but they're no longer property at all. And so the other person can't seize them because now they're just normal humans. Or, oh, sorry, I did it out of order. Or in the event that it was food, you can turn it into chametz. And then once Pesach arrives, there will be you will need to burn the chametz, and the fact that it is owed to somebody else is beside the point. They don't have a right to stop you from doing that. Okay, so these are, each one is a slightly different situation, but they're all things you can do to your property that prevent somebody else who has a right to it from taking it from you. And since one of them was freeing slaves, so apparently the Breita that thinks that if the woman injures her slave in this grievous way that would emancipate him if she's the owner, that succeeds in emancipating the slave, because it turns out that somebody else having rights to your slave, according to Rava, doesn't stop you from emancipating him, and you can emancipate him in a way that would effectively revoke the property rights of the other person. Okay. So
Deborah, yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt. Why just paint a scenario in which someone would not be able to have access. Someone would want to cut off their own access to something rather than let someone else have access to it.
So it might be that Rav is not saying that you would do it on purpose. He's just saying that it would work if you did do it. All right. So, for example, emancipation and chametz are things that happen automatically, right? They're not, especially emancipation as a result of injuring the slave. That's not something you did on purpose.
Right.
And you can also emancipate a slave on purpose, but he might not be necessarily thinking specifically of that. And right. Chametz might just be that, well, I'm sorry, you had a lien on Deborah's bakery, but tough, Deborah doesn't have any assets anymore because she burned all of them because she was supposed to. So that's your loss, not hers.
But that's only right, if it's right before Pesach.
Right. But Chametz and Shech it's plausible to say that Rava was thinking about a case where it happened not on purpose. And it right. just, the question is just, did it work?
Right. Okay.
With the dedication as a sacrifice is harder, but the truth is that if you dedicate your animal to be a sacrifice, you don't completely lose it. Like, you get credit for the sacrifice. You get kapara for whatever sin it is that you did that you're trying to atone for. In the event that it's a shlomim, you even get to eat it. So, and people dedicate animals as sacrifices voluntarily all the time.
But they're taking it away. The whole point is here that someone else has the right to this animal, and you don't want to give it to them.
Right. So suppose that I tomorrow secure a loan by putting a lien on my baby lamb. And then I get 2 weeks from now to a situation where it's the only lamb I've got. I want to eat a Korban Pesach. Sorry. I guess you're not getting paid back because I'm going to eat this lamb.
I see.
Right? Like, it's not totally not to my benefit to sacrifice the animal.
Right. And it's not a totally selfish act either.
Right. So I think actually that in the case of, in each of these cases, there is a sort of a societal benefit to letting this thing take place, that we approve of people offering sacrifices. We want people to want to do that. We want people, moreover, to have enough respect for God's possessions that they will say, oh, well, if it's God's, I guess I'm done with it, even if it's not fair. Like, I think we want to make that point. Likewise, I think we want to make the point that chametz is just gone once Pesach starts. It doesn't really matter what needs you had. It's not available.
Right.
And I think it's pretty clear that society benefits from having fewer slaves. Whether Rava agreed with me on that or not is hard to say, because he lives in a world in which slavery is normal and I don't.
Right.
But I would like to think that has something to do with it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so now we're going on to say that maybe, in fact, this is what the Breitot were disagreeing about, right? Let's suggest that maybe Lemat de Rava Tanaihi, maybe this statement that Rava made is in fact the thing that the Tanaim, that the two Breitot are disagreeing about. One of them thinks that if you emancipate a slave that someone else has rights to, it works, and the other one thinks, well, no, that doesn't work. I'm sorry, it's not yours. You can't emancipate it. But we don't like that. No, actually, both Breitot agree that Rava is correct, that if you emancipate a slave that belongs to somebody else, ordinarily, you emancipate a slave that somebody else had a right to take away from you, ordinarily, that would work and they lose their property rights. But in this case is different, according to one side of the Breita, one Breita and not the other. Right? The Breita that says that the wife can successfully emancipates the slave, it just straightforward Rava. She's the owner, she emancipated the slave, the husband loses, too bad. To explain the other side, though, to say that they really normally do believe in this thing of Rava, that emancipating a slave works, even if someone else has property rights to it, they are going to need this next line. V'hacha al muha rabbanan l'shiabuda debal. And here, in this case, the rabbis made the husband's property rights stronger than normal, so that it's true that she was supposed to be the owner and he was supposed to just have the right to use it. But then the rabbis intervened and they said, nah, he's also the owner. Which would then mean that even if normally emancipation would work, it won't work here because the husband's attachment to the slave is too strong. Or alternatively, we could say that neither Breita believes in the decree of Usha. In the end, it's going to turn out we can't learn anything at all about the decree of Usha or anything else from these Breitot, because you can analyze the dispute in so many different ways that you can't prove anything from it. Well, we're not quite done. Okay. And maybe what they're arguing about is whether whether the true owner is the person who has the right to use the thing, or the true owner is the person who has the ownership rights to the thing, which is a dispute that's been floating in the background since the beginning of this discussion, like 4 shiurim ago. And in that case, they would be parallel to the following dispute. And they would be arguing about this dispute as follows. Tanya. So somebody will call him Ruvain. Usually I like to insert women's names for the examples, but this one's gruesome, so we're just going to use Ruvain and Shimon. So Ruvain sold his slave to Shimon, but the deal was that the slave stays with Ruvain and continues to serve him for another 30 days, and then Ruvain will deliver the slave. So the slave belongs to Shimon as of now, but Shimon doesn't actually have any rights to use the slave services until 30 days in the future. So now during that time period, during those 30 days, suppose that either Reuven or Shimon murders the slave. Now, we have this law. Right, let's open a Shmot 21:20. And ordinarily, for this, I think we need to go back a pasuk or two before that. Ordinarily, if you hit somebody and they don't die, but they are grievously ill, what happens is we sort of lock you up until we find out whether they're going to die or not. And however long it takes for them to either die or recover, we hold on to you. If they recover, we let you go and we charge you damages. If they die, we put you to death as a murderer. At least that's the theory. That's seems to be what the Torah is saying in Psukim 18 and 19 in chapter 21. And then in verse 20, the Torah gives us sort of a contrast to that. If a man hits his male slave or his female slave with a stick, umeit tachat yado, and they die under his hand, nakom yanakem, they will be avenged, which seems to mean the owner gets the death penalty for killing his slave. But if the slave survives for a day or two, lo yukam, then he will not be avenged, ki kaspohu, because it was his money. And so it seems like we have a lower standard of what it means to have not murdered somebody if the person that you beat up was your slave, as opposed to if the person you beat up was a fellow free person. If you beat up a fellow free person, we wait as long as it takes to see whether they die or not. As long as they didn't fully recover, we're still waiting to see if you're a murderer. In the case of the slave, we wait a day or two. Not clear why it needs to say both a day and 2 days. There's a whole body of midrash about that, but leaving that aside for the moment, we wait a day or two. And if the slave is still alive after a day or two, you're off the hook. And the Torah says the reason why you're off the hook is because the slave is your money or your silver, depending on whether you think money is really a thing yet in the Torah. But I think money is reasonable here. Okay, so back to our Braita here. So Reuven sold the slave to Shimon. The slave is still working for Reuven for another 30 days. And during those 30 days, the question is, if Reuven or Shimon murders the slave, who gets this special leniency for a slave owner? Okay, so Rabbi Meir Omer, Rishon yeshno bedin yomo yomayim mipnei shu tachtav. Rabbi Meir says the first guy, Reuven, has the law of 1 or 2 days. He gets the leniency because the slave is still following his instructions. So he's the real owner. Kasavar kinyan perot ki kinyan haguf dami. And the reason he thinks that is because he thinks that owning the right to use something is the same thing as owning it. So Reuven is the one who has the right to give the slave orders and to use the things that he makes. Shimon doesn't have that right. Therefore, the fact that Shimon has officially title to the slave is beside the point. Clearly, Reuven is the owner. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Sheni yeshno bedin yomo yomayim mipnei shu kaspo. He says the second guy, Shimon, has this leniency of 1 or 2 days because the slave belongs to him. The slave is his property. And that's because kasavar kinyan perot lav ki kinyan haguf dami. He thinks that having the right to use something is not the same thing as owning it. Those things can be separated. So Shimon can be the true owner while Reuven is the only one who has the right to use. Rabbi Yosei Omer, by the way, none of what I'm saying should be construed to indicate that I don't think slavery is evil. This whole thing is really profoundly disturbing, but I don't have any answers for that. So we're just going to try to understand what it means and then go on. Rabbi Yosei Omer, Shnehem yeshnan bedin yomo yomayim. Rabbi Yosei says actually both of them are the owners insofar as it would give them this leniency of 1 or 2 days. Zem ibnei shu tachtav, zem ibnei shu kaspo. The Ruvain has the leniency because he has the right to give the slave instructions, and Shimon has the leniency because he owns the slave. And the Gemara comments on that, Misap Kale, Kinyan Perot I Kikinyan Haguftami, Ilo Kikinyan Haguftami. The Gemara comments that the reason Rabbi Yosei is saying this is that he's actually not sure whether the real owner is the person who has the right to use the slave or the person who owns the slave. And Vesafek Nefasha Lahakel. And since we're talking about potentially putting somebody to death for murder, and we're not sure whether to apply a leniency, so we always apply leniencies in cases of the death penalty. If we're not sure if we ought to put you to death, we don't put you to death. That's the rule. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Shnehem Einan B'dino Yomo Yomer. Rabbi Eliezer says neither of them is the owner such that they have a leniency of 1 or 2 days. Zeh mipnei she'eino tachtav. Shimon doesn't have the leniency because he doesn't have the right to give the slave instructions. V'zeh lefi she'eino kaspo. And Ruvain doesn't have this leniency because the slave doesn't belong to him. And so all 4 possibilities exist. And we are suggesting that, in fact, this Breita is parallel to the Breitot that we had about the wife and the husband, and that presumably the person who thought that the married woman is still the real owner of the slave and she can emancipate the slave is also going to think that Shimon is the real owner here, because Shimon is the one who has title but can't give instructions, right? So that's Rabbi Yehuda, as opposed to the other position in the Breita, who thinks that neither the husband nor the wife can free the slave by attacking the slave. That person presumably is going to agree with Rabbi Eliezer and say, it doesn't look to me like we have an owner here. Nobody is the owner of this slave. Okay. Amar Rava. So Rava asked a question about this position that we just said Rabbi Eliezer has, that there doesn't seem to be an owner here. My Talmud Rabbi Eliezer. What is Rabbi Eliezer's reason? Amar Kra, the Torah says, and this pasuk is the one I just quoted about the leniency of 1 or 2 days. 1 second. So Jerry asks, isn't the idea that the leniency is depending upon the deterrent, that there would be a financial loss? You mean because we assume that somebody who will lose money if the slave stops existing probably wasn't trying to kill him? Is that what you're saying?
Right. It's saying it's his money. He wouldn't try and destroy his own money. Therefore, he's not really trying to kill him. It was an accident.
Okay, so that is possible in the position of Rabbi Yosei, who's the one who says they both get the leniency, except that the Gemara said that's not his reason, but his position is compatible with that. And in fact, I would have guessed that that was his reason if the Gemara hadn't suggested the reason that they gave. I don't think it's compatible with any of the other positions because these guys both stand to lose a fair amount of money if the slave dies. So it's saying that either of them doesn't get the leniency seems to me is not compatible with this interpretation.
Oh, if the one who sold the slave, I mean, he only has, like 30 days worth of value. It's not a whole lot of value.
Okay, okay, that's fair. That's fair. So the position that only the buyer is the owner is also compatible. That's true. I actually think that the reasoning of the pasuk might be slightly different, which is to say that the societal norm is that it's normal to hit slaves, and you can't completely overturn that societal norm. And so we make some allowances for you to do your best not to kill them, but if you mess up, we'll be a little bit more forgiving than we would be otherwise. Whereas like just punching people in the nose as you walk down the street is not societally normal. But I don't love that either. I don't like anything about this. The whole thing is awful. But it seems to me that that's a more likely connection to the ownership. But it also seems to me that at least some of these guys are conceiving of it's his property thing as just a technicality. And it's not actually explaining a reason at all. It's just a technicality. Exactly how many of them think of it as a technicality that I couldn't be absolutely certain. But this thing we're about to read, it seems to me, does seem to see it as a technicality. Okay, so back in this line of the Gemara here, we said that the pasuk says because he's his property or because he's his money. The reason why it needs to say his money is that it needs to be his money alone, right? He has to be the only owner of the slave. That's what Rava said. And I think Rava may still be talking here. He's going on to talk about somebody else who said something that he thinks is in accord with Rabbi Eliezer. And he says, Kiman azla hada amar Amemar. So who was Amemar following when Amemar said the following? Ish v'isha shemachru b'nichsei melug lo asu v'lo klum. A husband and wife who sold their usufruct property have done nothing. It sounds like even the husband and the wife working together still, according to Amemar, don't actually own the property. Because neither of them could have sold it alone. When they do it together, it doesn't help. Which I have to say doesn't sound like a very practical way to own property. It seems to me it very significantly lowers the value of bringing property into the marriage if neither of you in a tight situation can sell the property for cash. It seems like that just makes the property less useful. But that seems to be what Amemar is saying. So Rava, continuing to talk, he says, Kiman ki Rabbi Eliezer. Who is Amemar following? Amemar must be following Rabbi Eliezer. Because Rabbi Eliezer is the one who believes that ownership is only one person at a time, more or less. And Amemar may have expanded that beyond the idea of 1 or 2 days and the leniency for the death penalty. But it seems like you can draw a line from Rabbi Eliezer saying that about ownership for the death penalty to Amemar saying it in general, that in general ownership, either you both own it or nobody, either one person owns it or nobody owns it, but you can't have this tangled mess and then tell me that they together own it. Okay. Mantana lahadetanu rabbanan. So who then is the author of the following Braita? Misha chetzio eved v'chetzio ben chorin. Somebody who is half slave and half free person. You might ask, how does that happen? Well, you have a slave who is owned in partnership by two people. For example, they in partnership own a business and the business owns a slave. Or you have two brothers who inherited a slave together from their father, that sort of thing. And then one of the brothers emancipates, not the kind of emancipation we saw earlier, which is automatic and frees the whole slave, but emancipates on purpose. Like they write an emancipation document and hand it to the slave, they're half of the slave. So now if I owned a slave in partnership with my sister and I free my half of the slave still belongs to my sister and no longer belongs to me. And this is actually from a practical financial perspective, not necessarily such a terrible thing, right? The slave could just assume whatever property rights I had. So if I had the right to use this slave on Tuesdays, now the slave has a right to work for himself on Tuesdays. Well, you could say that. The problem is more of a metaphysical one, in which an Eved Kanani is not quite Jewish. But an Eved Kanani that's freed is completely Jewish. So an Eved Kanani can, for example, only marry another Canaanite slave, but a Jew can't marry a Canaanite slave, right? So this person who's stuck in the middle is actually nobody, and they can't get married. And in the end, not here, but elsewhere, that is the reason why the law is, in fact, that if you have such a situation, we force the remaining owner to free the slave, because everybody has a right to get married, which is a very important data point in other discussions of whether people have a right to a normal life or whatever. But for our purposes here, the question is, we're not asking what to do with this person. We're just asking what happens to them while they are in this state. So we have a person who is half slave and half free, or v'chein eved shel shtei shutafim, or we have a slave who belongs to two partners. So it's basically the same person, but the day before. Those slaves can't go free with major limbs that don't grow back. This is a reference to the same rule that we last week were calling by the more biblical reference of knocking out a tooth or an eye. So the claim here is that a slave that has more than one owner has nothing to do with usufruct. It has nothing to do with marriage. It has nothing to do with one person having a right to use the slave and the other person has the right, there's property rights. This is two people who have identical rights, but each of them only has half of the rights in the slave. That slave actually can't be emancipated through that method because they don't have somebody who is their exclusive owner. And apparently that only works with an exclusive owner, which I think, excuse me, I think with reference to what Jerry was asking before, I think the only way to understand this part is that they just think of ownership as a technicality. Because if the issue is that we think you must have done it by mistake because you're the owner in terms of the murder, or we think that we need a disincentive to stop you from hitting the slave so hard, so we'll tell you if you knock out a tooth, you're going to have to give up the slave. Either of those really should apply to these guys just as much as it does to a full owner. It really seems here that this is just a technicality. Okay, so Amrli Rav Mordechai to Rav Ashi. Rav Mordechai said to Rav Ashi, and Rav Mordechai seems to be a very I don't know if I've heard of him elsewhere. He's not a common name in the Gemara, but he says, "Ahachi Amri Mishmei de Rava." This is what Rava said. Rabbi Eliezer he. This is that Rava also said. It seems like Rava is like running around the Talmud trying to find positions that correspond with Rabbi Eliezer. That is to say, positions that think that when we say the owner of a slave, we only mean it if the person is the exclusive owner. That this position that slaves that are owned in partnership, either between themselves and an owner or between two owners, they don't get freed. Milo Amar Rabbi Eliezer Kaspo Miyuchadlo. Didn't Rabbi Eliezer say that his money means his money that's only his? So Hachanami Avdoham Yuchadlo here also, and the language is a little different in this pasuk. Let's look at it. So we're still in Shemot 21, but we're a few psukim later. Now we're in pasuk 26. I closed my chumash. Sorry about that. If a man strikes the eye of his male slave or the eye of his female slave and destroys it, he sends him to freedom in place of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male slave or the tooth of his female slave, then he will send him to freedom in place of his tooth. Okay, so it doesn't actually say why there. It does use the word his slave quite a lot of times. And I think that's what we're referencing here. So here also it keeps saying his male slave, his female slave. So what does his mean? It means that it's just his, doesn't belong to anybody else. So the claim is that Rabbi Eliezer would also say that about the sending slaves free. So in the end, it's not. There's a much stronger position than the position we saw at the end of last week in the Breita that said that nobody can free the slave this way in a slave that's owned in partnership between a husband and a wife because of usufruct. This seems to be saying that any time that you have any kind of partnership owning a slave, all of the things that would be particular to the owner, all of which seem to be, no, some of them are in the slave's best interest, some of them are in the owner's best interest. But anytime you have things that are particular to the owner, Rabbi Eliezer, and following him, Rav Mordechai, and also following him, Rav Amemar, all of those people would say that in all of those cases, either you're the only owner of the slave, the exclusive owner of the slave, or there is no owner of the slave, and nobody can fulfill this role. All right, that's what I have for the evening. Are there questions? Okay. If you think of any, you can email me. My plan right now is that we're going to miss at least 1, maybe 2 weeks for Pesach, but I haven't completely decided exactly what's going on. We're definitely having class next week. And by then, hopefully I'll know what the schedule is for the rest of the season. But thank you. And I will see you next Monday.
Thanks a lot, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah.
I think the week after, that's 2 nights before Pesach.
Yeah,
I
that
would ask
one
to not have shear, please.
Correct. There's no question that's not happening. The question is whether people would be interested during Pesach or whether people are interested the Monday after Pesach. And I don't know whether either of those is an option either. I don't really want to cancel 3 weeks in a row, but I guess maybe I have to. I'm not sure.
So I think part of that will be up to you. Are you making Pesach?
Yeah, that would be the other reason that we're not having it that first Monday.
Okay.
I will personally either be cooking or sitting in the living room with my feet up and my eyes closed, depending.
Oh, well, yeah, I will undoubtedly be at the stove.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's for 2 weeks from tonight.
Yeah, so a week from
Right.
tonight we will have class. 2 weeks from tonight we will not have class. After that, I'll figure it out.
Okay, no problem. Thanks a lot, Deborah.
You're welcome. Good night.
Good night.